Welcome back for another episode of the Edwardo Series. Today, we're now in the book of Hebrews, another go-to book for most people who try to prove that the law is done away. In today's episode, Pastor Edwardo poses the question,
why go back and keep the law of Moses, the old covenant, when we have a better covenant? That's a good question, isn't it?
Let's see if his ideas hold up to the test of Scripture after we hear what Pastor Edwardo has to say about it.
I'll tell you another reason why we don't keep the law of Moses. And that is the fact that we have a better testament. What book would you read to learn about a better testament? How about the book of Hebrews? It's a book of better things. The word better is one that appears several times throughout the book. In Hebrews 7 and verse 22, the writer said, by so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. And again in chapter 8 and verse 6, but now hath he obtained a more excellent ministry, by how much also he is the mediator of a better covenant. See, better testament, better covenant. Why go back and keep the law of Moses, the old covenant, when we have a better covenant? That's a good question, isn't it?
Pastor Edwardo's idea is that we don't keep the law of Moses because we're now under a newer, better covenant. But if you read what the new covenant is, it's all about the law being written in our hearts. So immediately, Pastor Edwardo's interpretation makes no biblical sense. Pastor Edwardo is mushing some things together here, and it might clarify a lot if we pick it apart. For one, Pastor Edwardo keeps talking about the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, and the Law of Moses as if they're all synonymous. All these different terms don't mean the exact same thing. The Old Testament is the first 39 books of the Bible. The Old Covenant, which actually the Bible calls the First Covenant, is written in the Old Testament. Also, the First Covenant continued into the New Testament, and the New Covenant is written in the Old Testament, in Jeremiah 31. And of course, the Law of Moses is contained within both the First Covenant and the New Covenant in both the Old and New Testaments. So you can't just squish all these different terms together and say they mean the same thing. So why go back and keep the Law of Moses when we have a better covenant? Because that better covenant, the New Covenant, is all about the Law of Moses, which is actually God's law, being written in our new heart of flesh, so that we now keep and do all of God's commandments, judgments, and ordinances that he gave to Moses.
Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 4. We are impressed with the fact that Christ is better. See, this book shows the superiority of Christ. Being made so much better, he said, Hebrews 1 and verse 4.
Christ is so much better than what? Pastor Edwardo is giving us the impression that Christ and the New Testament are better than all that Law of Moses stuff in the Old Testament. But let's read that verse, Hebrews 1:4, and see what it's really talking about. Being made so much better than the angels, as he hath by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. This has nothing to do with the law. This verse says that Christ is better than the angels. Christ, as the Word of God that created all things, has always been better than the angels because he created them. Yet, Pastor Edwardo is leading us to believe that Christ is better than the law of Moses because he's only quoting half of a verse way out of context.
The New Testament, the better testament, has better hope. Hebrews 7:19 says, the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, by the which we draw nigh unto God. The better covenant has better promises. Hebrews 8:6 talks about that. How that he is the mediator of a better covenant, which was established upon better promises.
Yes, the new covenant is a better covenant, but what does that mean? How is it better? Because now, under the new covenant, we no longer have a stony heart, but a heart of flesh, in which God writes his law and puts his Spirit within us to cause us to walk in his law, doing his commandments. We must also remember that just because there's a new covenant or a better covenant, doesn't mean that God has canceled, done away, or broken any previous covenant he's made. Aren't you glad that God has kept his covenant with Noah, that he will not flood the earth again? Psalm 89:34 says, My covenant will I not break, nor alter the thing that has gone out of my lips.
And following that statement, you have some of those better promises of the better covenant. They all start with the words, I will, or will I. Like verse 10. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts.
What was that?
I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. Remember, tables of hearts versus tables of stones, 2 Corinthians 3.
Do you remember tables of heart versus tables of stones? From episode 5 and the prophecy from Ezekiel chapters 11 and 36? And how it's all about God causing us to walk in his statutes and judgments, keeping and doing the law God gave to Moses?
I will be to them a God, they shall be to me a people. Verse 12, I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. Better promises.
Remember what this is talking about. Who is he talking to? Hebrews is quoting Jeremiah 31, the new covenant with Israel and Judah. God writing his law in our hearts and minds. These aren't just new or better things that suddenly popped up in the book of better things. It was all prophesied. It all came from the Old Testament. We also need to remember to ask ourselves, how is it better? What makes this a better covenant with better promises? Because God himself will now write his law in our hearts and cause us to walk in his statutes with a heart of flesh instead of a heart of stone.
But also the better testament has better sacrifices. Hebrews 9:23. It was therefore necessary that the patterns of things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Better sacrifices. This book shows the superiority of the sacrifice of Christ over those sacrifices that were offered continually under the Old Testament.
This shows that Pastor Edwardo doesn't really understand what Christ's sacrifice was for, or what the sacrifices under the law of Moses were for. The first thing to realize is that, according to the law, not all the sacrifices were for sin. There were burnt offerings, where he who offers the sacrifice gives it of his own voluntary will, just because he loves God and wants to give him something. There's the meat offering, which was not an animal sacrifice, but an offering of fine flour and oil. There were peace offerings, and also trespass offerings and sin offerings. Also, there were the daily burnt offerings and sacrifices every Sabbath day and every new moon and for all the feast days that had nothing to do with sin or atonement for sin. Secondly, what did Jesus die for? He died for sin. But what sin? Whose sin? Didn't Jesus say that he was not sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel? Isn't it the death of the husband that looses his wife from her adultery? Jesus was not offered up by a priest on the altar in the temple as the animal sacrifices commanded in the law were. His sacrifice was to offer himself to die because only the death of the husband could save his adulterous and divorced wife Israel. No animal sacrifice commanded in the law could bring Israel back after God divorced them, which is why the husband had to die and rise again. Also, nowhere does it say that Jesus' sacrifice replaced or did away with the animal sacrifices in the temple. And Paul himself proves that it didn't in Acts 21:20-24. After Paul tells James and the elders everything God is doing among the Gentiles, it says, And when they heard it, they glorified the Lord and said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. And they are informed of thee, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. All these things that people are hearing about Paul are false. Paul never taught anyone to forsake God's law given through Moses, and yet most Christians today believe this lie. So what do James and the elders tell Paul to do about this? Do therefore this that we say to thee. We have 4 men which have a vow on them. Them take and purify thyself with them, and be at charges with them, that they may shave their heads, and all may know that those things whereof they were informed concerning thee are nothing, but that thou thyself also walkest orderly, and keepest the law. The vow that Paul is taking with 4 other men is a Nazirite vow from Numbers 6:1-21, which we can see from the fact that they're shaving their heads. But in the Nazirite vow, the Nazirite has to offer a he-lamb, a ewe-lamb, and a ram as sacrifices, along with other meat and drink offerings. So here in Acts 21, the Apostle Paul is responsible of offering for himself and 4 other men 15 animal sacrifices in the temple. And we can see that he did this in Acts 21:26. Then Paul took the men, and the next day, purifying himself with them, entered into the temple to signify the accomplishment of the days of purification, until that an offering should be offered for every one of them. And remember, Paul does these things to prove his accusers false, that he does not teach anyone to forsake Moses, he does not teach against circumcision, and that he himself keeps the law of Moses. So, sorry, Pastor Edwardo, but there are animal sacrifices in the New Testament, being offered by Paul no less.
And it also has better blood. Hebrews 12 and verse 24 talks about the better blood. To Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better things than that of Abel. Read this book. You'll learn that there's things the blood of bulls and goats could not do, that only the blood of Christ can accomplish. And so let me ask again, why go back and keep the law of Moses when we have a better testament? Doesn't make any sense, does it?
Why go back and keep the law of Moses when we have a better testament? Because that better testament tells us to keep the law of Moses. Through this episode, we've seen that, yes, there is a better covenant, but how is it better? Because God's law is now written in our hearts, and the Spirit of God will now work in us to keep God's law given through Moses, because he's taken away our stony hearts that continually broke the law. If even Paul, as a believer under the new covenant, goes to great lengths to prove that he keeps the law, even by taking a Nazirite vow and offering 15 animal sacrifices, how do we have any right to say that Paul says it's done away with? Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:1, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." And if Paul is willing to offer animal sacrifices in the temple as a believer in Jesus to prove to everyone that he keeps the law, then we too ought to keep the law of Moses.
Why go back and keep the law of Moses, the old covenant, when we have a better covenant? That's a good question, isn't it? And so let me ask again, why go back and keep the law of Moses when we have a better testament? Doesn't make any sense, does it?
Hi everyone. If you have a reason or a verse for why we should not keep the law of God given through Moses, leave it in the comments section below, and I'll try to answer it biblically in a bonus 16th episode at the end of this series. Thanks for watching!